Okay, this is part 3 of the final exam practice think aloud video. We're finally into the proofs section. So question 30. In which of the following is line 3 correctly derived as specified by the included justification? Again, you should pause the video and answer these on your own before watching me answer them and think aloud. Okay, so let's just go through them in order here. We've got if K then not J, so a conditional, not J, we've got the negation of the consequent, therefore not K, modus tollens, check. That is accurate. This is the negation of that, and we concluded the negation of that. Looks good. Next, we have a conditional statement. We have the negation of the antecedent. That already is looking like a mistake. And we've concluded the negation of the consequent. That is not modus tollens. This is modus tollens. You need to have the negation of the consequent, not the antecedent. And note, J is the negation of not J, and vice versa. Okay, so this one is not. How about C? We have a disjunction. We've got the negation of one disjunct, and we've concluded the negation of the other disjunct and cited DS. That is not correct. Why is that not correct? Because with DS, we don't conclude the negation of the other disjunct. We just conclude the other disjunct. C or D, not D, therefore C, not C. Okay, D. If Q then P, this is already looking like a mistake, therefore Q. This is not a case of modus ponens. Why not? Because modus ponens says if you have a conditional and you have the antecedent, then you can conclude the consequent, but this did the opposite of that, and that is not a valid inference. You could do a truth table to show that each one of these is an invalid argument. Okay, E. If A then B, B therefore A. That's exactly the same pattern we just looked at, and that is invalid. That is not an application of modus ponens. How about if C then D, not C, therefore not D? I feel like we saw that one already. That looks just like B above. That is not an application of modus tollens. You need to negate the consequent, not the antecedent. How about E or F? Negation of E, therefore other disjunct. That looks good. That is an application of DS. Finally, we've got if not G, then not H. Not G, therefore not H, modus ponens. Looks good. We've got a conditional statement, we have the antecedent of the conditional, and then we've got the consequent of the conditional, which is modus ponens. Okay, for the next two questions, we're going to use the given justifications to complete the proof. Okay, so 31. One simp. Well, there's two options here. We could get not L or not N, and it's not clear which one we should do unless we want one or the other. So another thing that we might do is kind of work backwards and forward. I know the last line is going to be the conclusion no matter what, whatever that's worth. And I know I'm going to get it by simplifying something. I'm going to get it by simplifying line 6. So I know that G is going to be part of a conjunction on line 6. How can I work backwards or forwards? What do I do? Well, let's just start by working backwards entirely. So I know I want G. I'm going to look for where G shows up in the premises. I see that it is wrapped up in this sort of compound antecedent here. And I know that I'm going to be separating G out of a conjunction, and here G is part of a conjunction, so maybe I'm going to get G and L. How could I get G and L out of this conditional statement? Well, notice that GL is the negation of the antecedent. Modus Ponens is a rule, and hey, it says we're going to be using Modus Ponens, is a rule that allows us to conclude the negation of an antecedent. What do you need in order to get the negation of an antecedent? You need to have the negation of the consequent. So you need to have W. How do we get W? Well, W is up here, so I want W. Right, so now I'm thinking, I want W. W is part of a disjunction. DS is a rule, and hey, we're going to be using that. DS is a rule that'll allow us to get a disjunct out of a disjunction if you have the negation of the other disjunct. So we're going to need N. Oh, and that's one of my options. So now now that I've got a plan, I can work backwards. So I know I want N. Now I've got the negation of a disjunct, so I can get W by 2, 4 DS. And now that I have the negation of this consequent by 3, 5 modus tollens, I can get the negation of the antecedent, G and L, and now I can simplify off the conclusion that I'm trying to derive here. Done. Okay, next, 32. Well, I immediately know I can put the conclusion here. That's where I'm going. What else do we see? So 2, 3 modus ponens is our first line. So let's look at 2 and 3 and apply modus ponens. We've got a conditional, we have the antecedent, so we can conclude the consequent, and don't include unnecessary parentheses when you're doing this online for auto-grading reasons. Okay, 4, simp. Great. Now we have a choice again. Right, so we could get L or not J, but which one do we want? That's the question. Well, which one do we want? Which one do we want? Let's start by working backwards. So we want H ultimately, and we're going to get H by 1 and 6 modus tollens, right? So H is the negation of the antecedent, which means in order to use modus tollens, 6 is going to need to be the negation of the consequent. So we must have derived this such that we're using modus tollens on lines 1 and 6 here to get H. Okay, so how did we get L and B? It says we use the conjunction rule. That means we need to have L, and we looked at lines 2 and 5, and we need to have B. Well, we've got B on line 2, so that means 5 must be L. Okay, that does it. Good. And we can double check our work. So 2, 3 modus ponens. Got this. Good. Okay, simp. Done. Now conjunction. B and L, put them together, L and B. That allows us to make the negation of the consequent, so we can get the negation of the antecedent. All right, it all checks out when we double check our work. Okay, for the next 2 questions, we're going to fill in the missing justifications. Okay, how did we get B? Well, where does B show up here? B is part of a conditional, and it's part of a conjunction, and we have a rule that says we can derive a conjunct out of a conjunction. So we're going to just do 4 simp. How about not A? How could we get not A? Well, let's look at where it shows up in the premises we have to work with. We've got the original ones, and we've got a new derived one, but there's no A in that, so that doesn't help. Okay, so there's 2 places for an A, and we're trying to get not A. One is a disjunction. When you have a disjunction, if you use DS, you can get the disjunct out of it. So we could get A or Q, but we don't want A or Q, we want not A, so we're probably not working on that. The other one is this conditional here. And we have a rule that allows us to get the negation of an antecedent, right? Modus tollens. If we have B, and we do have B. So this looks good. So lines 1 and 5, modus tollens is how we get not A. Okay, next we're working on Q. Again, let's look at where else Q shows up. It shows up here and here. So how can we get Q? Well, let's look at the way we don't get it. This is a conditional. It's part of a consequent. We do have a rule that allows us to get the consequent on its own line, but that would give us not Q, like if we had not Z, which we don't. So that's not going to help. But we also have this disjunction. We do have a rule that will allow us to derive one of the disjuncts if you have the negation of the other disjunct, and we do. So 2, 6, ds. And line 8. How do we get Z? Well, there's only one place Z is in any of our lines above. It's on line 3 here. And we do have a rule that allows us to derive the negation of an antecedent if we have the negation of the consequent. Q, do we have Q? We just derived that. So 3 and 7, Modus Ponens, gets us our conclusion, Z. Okay, question 34. Line 4. We want to derive A. How can we get A? Well, let's look at where we've already got it. We've got it on line 3, and we have it on line 1. Now, line 1 is all kinds of complicated. It could be that one, but I immediately see that it's line 3 is how we're going to get it. So, line 3 has A as a consequent, and we do have a rule that allows us to derive the consequent if we have the antecedent, and we clearly do here right above it. So lines 2, 3, Modus Ponens. Next, we want to derive A and B. It's a conjunction, so I'm thinking two possibilities. One is I get A and B on their own lines, and I use the conjunction rule to make a conjunction. The other possibility is that A and B is already in what I've got to work with, and I use one of the rules to extract it. It's part of a disjunction, but it's the negation of A and B that's part of this disjunction. And if we were to use DS, the best we could do is get one of the disjuncts, the negation of what we want on a line. So that doesn't look promising. But since we do have B and A, that's clearly the way to do it. Now, we want to, if this wasn't already done for you, why do we want A and B and not B and A? Well, notice once we derive A and B, that'll give us the negation of a disjunct here. So I can already see we're headed towards a DS. Okay, so lines 2, 4, conjunction rule. And as we just said, now this is the negation of that, which by DS allows us to get that. 1, 5, DS. And notice we removed the parentheses because they are no longer necessary. So there's no parentheses here. And then finally, how do we get not Z? If you didn't just obviously see it, just look in the above premises for where a Z shows up. And notice we're kind of sort of disregarding tildes when we're looking where things show up, because tildes come and go with various rules, right? So we're looking at 1 and 6 are the possibilities, but since 6 is so hopefully obvious, this is just going to be 6 simp. Done. All right, we're getting close. I think this is our last 4 questions. Okay, 35. So again, we've got 2 strategies. One is the work backwards strategy, which I recommend doing just to practice it, especially for the longer ones. It can help you to get in that habit, but doing things you see will also probably work. All right, in this case, and you can derive unnecessary lines. Online it'll be set up so that that doesn't happen for auto-grading reasons, but as long as we're doing it by hand, let's just go for it, because as long as lines are derived by using the rules correctly, it's fine. So whenever I see a conjunction, like one option is to just immediately simplify out both conjuncts, just in case you need them. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. As long as you apply rules correctly, it doesn't matter. Okay, now I have 2 new things to work with. What else do I see? Well, I'm immediately seeing an application of modus ponens right away. I've got a conditional, I've got the antecedent, so I can get the consequent. Notice this means I never did need x. So 2 for modus ponens. But what do you do if you just don't see it? Hopefully you have done so much practice that you just see it. That's the value of practice. The patterns start to emerge like one of those pictures where you have to cross your eyes and look at it. I don't know if that's a helpful analogy. But the more practice you do, the more you just see the patterns in what initially looks like gibberish. But if you're not just seeing the patterns, what's your strategy? Your strategy is to go through and systematically see which rules you can apply. So the simplest one, simp, you can apply simp. We just did that. What else can we apply? Well, go through the list. If you don't see it, go through the list. Start with, say, disjunctive syllogism. Can you apply that? No, we have no disjunctions. Can you apply modus tollens? Well, we do have a conditional. In order to use modus tollens, we would also need the negation of the consequent, not z. Do we have that? No, so we can't use it. Can we use modus ponens? Oh yeah, we just did that. Can you use conjunction? You can use conjunction literally any time because you can make a conjunction out of anything. So that leaves you with the question, do you want a conjunction? Don't make a conjunction unless you want one. So you can kind of leave that one out of your strategy unless suddenly you're thinking, well, if I had a conjunction, I could do a thing. That's when you know you want one. Okay, so the only one we really needed here was one simp. $36. Okay, I'm going to reason through this one working backwards. So I know I want z. So I'm ultimately thinking like I want z. And when you're doing this online in a final exam situation, I recommend having pen and paper on hand to do these by hand. If you're getting really good at this and they're super easy for you and you can just fill them in online, then do it that way. But if at any point you get stuck, write it down. When you get stuck, write it down. Put that on as your slogan. Okay, so I want z. I'm working towards this. Next, I'm going to look for where does z show up in the premises. I see it here on line 4, and it's part of a disjunction. And so I'm immediately thinking, am I going to get this by ds? If so, that means I want not c. If I have not c, then I would have z, or c, not c, therefore z. So can I get not c? Do I have that? No. But where does z show up? Shows up right here. And what I want is the negation of an antecedent. When I hear myself say that, I'm thinking modus tollens, because modus tollens is the rule that allows me to derive the negation of an antecedent. So I'm thinking I'm going to use modus tollens to get this. What would I need in order to use modus tollens? Well, I would need the negation of the consequent. In other words, I would need A and B. So how do I get that? Well, let's look where A and B are in the premises. Well, I see I've got an A and a B. And whenever you want a conjunction, you've got 2 options. One is you're going to make it using the conjunction rule, or the other is you can derive it if there's already a conjunction in some of your premises and you can use a rule to get it. In this case, we can make it. So that's my plan. Conjunction to get A and B, modus tollens to get not C, ds to get this. Now, if I had written this out of the way, like I've got a little plan down here, leave myself some space, go 5, A and B, looking at lines 1 and 2 using the conjunction rule. Now that I've got this, I have the negation of the consequent here. So line 6, I will derive the negation of the antecedent. Lines 3 and 5, modus tollens. Now that I have not C, That means I have the negation of a disjunct, which means I can derive the other disjunct. And that is the conclusion I wanted, QED. So working backwards is one way to go about it. The other, again, is to just shuffle through the rules and see which things you can derive when using the rules correctly. The thing you should look at is not the schematic, but the wording of the rule. If you have a conditional and you have the antecedent, then you can derive the consequent, that kind of wording. 37. I want Z. How am I going to get it? Where does it show up in my premises? Well, I see it right here, and it is not Z is the antecedent, so what I want is the negation of an antecedent, so I'm immediately thinking modus tollens, which means if I had the negation of the consequent, I could use modus tollens to get Z. So I want B. How can I get B? Where does that show up? Well, it's part of this disjunction, and now I'm immediately saying I've got the negation of this other disjunct, so I'm just going to start there. I've got A or this thing I want, not A. By 1, 2, ds. Okay, so again, I'm wanting B. How do I get B? Well, B is the consequent of a conditional. If I have the antecedent, I can use modus ponens, and we do have the antecedent. Okay, so I got this. Now I want to get Z, and my plan was to use modus tollens. So looking at lines 3 and 5 here, I have a conditional, I have the negation of the consequent, so I derive the negation of the antecedent, 3, 5, modus tollens. Done. And 1 to go, 38. This one looks long. Okay, so I want Z. How am I going to get Z? And this one is complicated because Z shows up in 2 places, and for both of them is the consequent of a conditional. So I'm immediately thinking modus ponens because that's the rule that allows me to derive the consequent of a conditional if I have the antecedent. So that means I want either if A then C or B and C. If I could get either one of these on a line, I could get Z. So can I get either one of these? Which one should we start with? Let's just, because I wrote it down first, see if we can get A or C. Can I get A or if A then C? Is there an if A then C anywhere in the premises? No. How could I get if A then C? There actually is a way, but we don't have a rule that'll allow you to get it. So one way you'll end up ruling this out is just not being able to see anything. How about B and C? Is there a way I could get that? Well, I see a bunch of B's, and I see a bunch of C's. C is the consequent of a conditional, so I'm thinking like I might be able to get, and B is the consequent of a conditional, so maybe I'll be able to get B and C on their own lines and then use conjunction to put them together, because notice I want a conjunction, and whenever I hear myself say, if I had this conjunction, I could do a thing, I'm thinking maybe I need to make that conjunction using the conjunction rule. So this is my plan. I'm going to try and get B and C on their own line. How do I do that? Well, if I had A, I could get B using modus ponens. Can I get A? Where does A show up? I am seeing disjunctive syllogism here. So I've got A or D and not D, so I conclude A, 4, 5, DS. Now that I have A, I have the antecedent of the conditional on line 2, so I can use Modus Ponens to get B. And now that I have B, I have the antecedent of the conditional on line 3, so I can use Modus Ponens to get C. And now, as I said before, I was trying to get B and C, and I've just got B and C, so I can use the conjunction rule to put that together. And that gives me the antecedent of the conditional on line 6. Done. And that is the last question of the exam. All right. So if you missed questions, be sure to figure out which unit and module it came from so you can do targeted study as you review for the final exam.